John, why did you leave me so soon? I miss you.
When my husband died, I thought grief would unite our family. Instead, my stepson turned into my enemy. Within days, he forced me out of the home I built with his father. He thought he had erased me, left me powerless, but fate had other plans. Because just 1 week later, everything he loved began to collapse, and it was only the beginning of his downfall. My name is Alea, and I was 42 when this all happened. For more than 20 years, my husband was the center of my life. He was my partner, my protector, and the man who made me believe in love after I had nearly given up on it. Together, we built a home filled with laughter, memories, and quiet dreams. When he passed away suddenly, it felt like someone had ripped the ground out from under me. The silence in the house was suffocating. His favorite chair sat empty, his coffee mug untouched in the kitchen, and the scent of his cologne still lingered in our bedroom. Every corner of the home reminded me of him, and though it was painful, it was also comforting. That house was the last piece of him I had left. But I wasn't alone, not completely. My husband had a son from his first marriage, Ethan. He was in his mid-20s, ambitious, and cold in ways I could never fully understand. I had always tried to bridge the gap between us, but he kept his distance, treating me as though I were an intruder in his life. My husband always reassured me that, in time, Ethan would soften, that deep down, he'd recognize the love I had given both of them. After the funeral, I expected grief to pull us closer. I thought we would lean on each other, share the pain of losing him, and honor his memory together. But from the very first night, I noticed something unsettling. Ethan didn't look broken. He looked calculating. While I wept quietly in my room, he wandered the house like he was inspecting it, not as a son mourning his father, but as a man sizing up what he believed now belonged to him. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Grief makes you see things that aren't there. I told myself he was simply trying to cope in his own way. But then came the small signs I couldn't ignore. The way he locked up documents in his room, the dismissive tone when I asked about bills, the sharpness in his eyes when I reminded him that both his father and I built this house. I still wanted to believe we could coexist. That maybe my fears were wrong. But deep down, I felt a storm brewing. I had no idea how quickly that storm would destroy everything I thought I had left. In the days following the funeral, I clung to the walls of my home like a child afraid of being abandoned twice. I would walk past the photographs of my husband, trace my fingers over the smiling faces, and whisper prayers that he could somehow still see me. But the more I tried to hold on, the more I realized Ethan was already pulling everything apart. It started with small things. One morning, I came downstairs to find movers carrying out my husband's office chair. I froze in the doorway, my heart racing. "Who told you to take that?" I demanded. The men looked confused. "Your son gave the order." Ethan appeared. Behind them, his expression casual, almost smug. "It's just an old chair," he said flatly. "No need to clutter the house with junk." Junk. That chair wasn't just furniture. It was where my husband spent late nights finishing his work, where he sat reading letters to me, where we had laughed together in the glow of the lamp. My voice shook as I told them to stop. But Ethan overruled me, his tone sharp, final. For the first time, I realized my voice carried no weight in the house I had shared for years. Days later, I noticed the locks had been changed. When I asked, "Ethan, why my keys no longer worked on certain doors?" he shrugged. "I'm protecting Dad's property. You never know who might come around." The implication was clear. I wasn't trusted. The humiliation only deepened when family friends visited. I had dressed carefully, preparing to host them in honor of my husband's memory. But as soon as they arrived, Ethan took over. He greeted them, led them through the house. And when I tried to speak, he interrupted, dismissing me with a cold smile. At one point, he even said, "She doesn't really handle the important matters." Dad always trusted me with those. The sting of his words burned hotter than the guests' awkward silence. Each night, I lay awake wondering how it had come to this. Was I imagining his cruelty? Was grief distorting my mind? But the more I tried to rationalize, the more undeniable it became. Ethan didn't see me as family. He saw me as an obstacle. The breaking point came one evening when I found him in my husband's study, rifling through drawers. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Looking for what's rightfully mine," he said without hesitation. He held up a folder of property documents, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "This house, the accounts, All of it. You were just temporary. His words cut deeper than any blade. Temporary. As though my marriage, my years of love and sacrifice, meant nothing. I felt my chest tighten, my knees weaken, but I refused to let him see me crumble. I told him the house was built by both me and your father, that my husband wanted me to have security. Ethan laughed. A low, bitter laugh that sent chills down my spine. Dad isn't here to protect you anymore. And without him, you're nothing. That night, I cried until my throat was raw. I thought the pain of losing my husband was unbearable, but the pain of being erased, of being cast out by someone I had once tried to love, was even worse. Then came the final blow. One morning, I returned home from the market to find my belongings packed in boxes, stacked at the front door like trash waiting to be collected. Ethan stood there, arms crossed, his expression cold as stone. "It's time you left," he said. "This isn't your home anymore." My body went numb. "You can't do this," I whispered. But he already had. He had called the lawyer, shifted the accounts, and taken control of everything my husband had left behind. And with the ruthless efficiency of a man who felt invincible, he shoved me out of the house, leaving me standing on the porch, my life reduced to cardboard boxes. The neighbors watched in silence. Some pitied me, others whispered behind closed doors. And Ethan? He closed the door in my face, shutting me out of the only place where I had ever felt safe. In that moment, I thought I had lost everything, but if I believed that was the end, I was wrong, because the storm had only just begun. The first night away from my home, I sat in a small motel room staring at the cracked ceiling, clutching the last photo I had of my husband. The walls reeked of smoke, the bedspread was stained, and the air felt heavy with despair. I wasn't supposed to be here. That house had been my life, my memories, my only anchor after his death. Yet Ethan had stolen it with the coldness of a stranger, and the world didn't seem to care. But grief doesn't stop bills from coming. Within days, I realized I had almost nothing. Ethan had cut off access to joint accounts, changed passwords, and even canceled cards in my name. I walked into the bank one morning, desperate for answers, only to be told my accounts were frozen pending review. The clerk avoided my eyes, her voice mechanical, as if she had rehearsed the line with Ethan himself. I wanted to believe this was temporary, that justice would prevail. But each time I reached for help, I found another door closed. Lawyers turned me away, citing complications in the will. Relatives who had once shared dinners in my kitchen suddenly grew silent, siding with Ethan or avoiding the conflict altogether. Alone, powerless, and grieving, I began to question everything. Meanwhile, Ethan flourished. He hosted loud parties in the very living room where my husband and I had celebrated anniversaries. I heard from neighbors how he boasted about being the rightful heir, how he strutted around with new clothes, expensive watches, and a smug smile. The house I had cherished was no longer a sanctuary. It had become his playground, and yet, deep inside me, something stirred, a faint whisper telling me not to give up. My husband had trusted me, loved me, and shared his life with me. That bond couldn't be erased by signatures on a piece of paper. Still, Ethan seemed unstoppable. One afternoon, I returned to the house to plead for just a few personal items. My husband's letters, his photographs, small keepsakes that meant nothing to anyone but me. Ethan met me at the door, his arms folded across his chest. "You don't belong," he sneered. "Whatever you think you had with my father, it's over. Move on," I begged, my voice breaking. "Just let me have his letters. They're all I have left." His eyes narrowed and he leaned closer, his words dripping with cruelty. "Everything he owned is mine now, even his memory." That sentence carved itself into my soul. He wasn't just after the house or the money. He wanted to erase me, to strip me of any connection to the man I had loved. I stumbled away that night, my heart heavy, my body weak. For days I wandered between cheap motels and friends' couches, haunted by the feeling that I had been erased from my own life. Every memory I held dear was locked behind doors I could no longer open. But the universe has a way of shifting when arrogance grows too large. While Ethan reveled in his newfound power, whispers began to reach me. Rumors of his reckless spending, shady business deals, and debts piling up. At first, I brushed them off, thinking they were just stories neighbors told to ease my pain. But as days passed, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Ethan wasn't as invincible as he thought. Still, I couldn't allow myself hope. Not yet. I had been crushed once, and I knew the danger of clinging to fragile dreams. But late at night, as I stared at the photo of my husband, I felt the faintest flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. The possibility that justice might still find me. And then, it happened. The truth hit me like a thunderstorm, sudden and violent, tearing through the darkness Ethan had built around me. It was a gray morning when the first crack in Ethan's empire appeared. I had gone to a nearby cafe, one of the few places where I could sit unnoticed, sip weak coffee, and pretend for a moment that my life hadn't collapsed. The television above the counter played the local news, and that's when I heard his name, promising young entrepreneur Ethan Price accused of fraud. I froze, my cup halfway to my lips. The reporter's voice cut through the chatter of the cafe, each word striking me like lightning. Images of Ethan flashed across the screen, smiling, in expensive suits, shaking hands at business events. Then came the footage of protests outside one of his offices, investors demanding answers, shouting about stolen money and false promises. I couldn't breathe. Could it be true? For weeks, Ethan had paraded around like a king, but behind the walls of my old home, he had been weaving lies. The wealth he flaunted wasn't inherited security. It was a fragile tower built on deception. My heart pounded as I realized the irony. He had thrown me out in his hunger for power, but the very empire he had sacrificed family for was beginning to crumble beneath his feet. The news spread quickly. By evening, neighbors whispered openly, "Did you hear about Ethan? They say he tricked people into investing." Another voice added, "He mortgaged the house too, the very house his stepmother lived in." Their words reached me like scattered pieces of a puzzle, forming a clearer picture of his greed. I remembered the nights he had locked himself in my husband's study, the stacks of papers he guarded like treasure. Those weren't just property, documents. They were his schemes, his plans to turn grief into profit. At first, I felt a bitter satisfaction, but as more details surfaced, my feelings shifted. Ethan hadn't just ruined me. He had dragged strangers, families, and workers into his web. People who had trusted him with their savings, their futures. They were broken now, just as I was. Days later, the proof arrived in my hands. A former employee of Ethan's, someone who had known my husband, reached out to me. His voice was heavy with guilt as he handed me a folder of documents. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. Inside were contracts, forged signatures, and evidence of the lies Ethan had spun. The weight of those papers made my hands tremble. For weeks, I had been powerless. For weeks, I had been silenced. But now, I held the truth, undeniable, damning, truth that could strip Ethan of everything he had stolen. I stayed up all night staring at those pages, my emotions a storm of anger, grief, and grim resolve. My husband had trusted Ethan with his name, his legacy, and Ethan had twisted it into something poisonous. The next morning, I walked past the house that used to be mine. Music blared inside, laughter spilling out onto the street. Ethan was still, celebrating, blind to the storm about to break over him. I watched from the shadows, my fingers tightening around the folder. He thought he had erased me. He thought I was finished. But he was wrong, because now I carried the one thing more powerful than his arrogance. The truth. And though I wasn't ready yet, though I was still raw and trembling, I knew one thing for certain. Ethan's world was about to collapse. The documents weighed on me like a double-edged sword. In them lay Ethan's undoing, but also my husband's name, dragged through mud by his own son. Each time I looked at the forgeries, the fake contracts, the false promises, my chest tightened. If I exposed him, I'd be destroying the last image of my husband's legacy. But if I stayed silent, Ethan would continue to thrive on lies. Meanwhile, Ethan only grew bolder. Despite the whispers spreading through town, he held extravagant parties, inviting people who once respected my husband. He poured expensive wine, boasted of deals he claimed were about to close, and laughed like he was untouchable. From the outside, he seemed unstoppable. But behind those gilded doors, the cracks deepened. Debt collectors circled, angry investors demanded answers, and the house, my house, was mortgaged to the brink. I heard from a neighbor that Ethan had even pawned family heirlooms, pieces my husband had cherished, treating them as nothing more than cash to fuel his vanity. I felt powerless, watching him turn everything sacred into currency. Nights became unbearable. I lay awake in my rented room, haunted by the thought that my husband's memory was being desecrated. The grief that had nearly broken me after his death now twisted into something sharper: rage. One afternoon, I returned to the house, folder in hand, determined to confront him. But Ethan met me at the door with his usual smirk. "Back again?" he sneered. "You just don't learn, do you?" I begged him one last time. "Stop this before it's too late. You're destroying everything your father built." His laughter echoed through the hallway. "You think I care about what he built? He's gone. This is mine now. And soon you'll be nothing more than a sad woman telling stories no one believes." The cruelty in his voice nearly broke me. Nearly. But as he shut the door in my face, I realized something. Ethan was no longer just a cruel stepson. He was a man teetering on the edge of his own destruction, blind to the cliff beneath his feet. And I held the push that could send him over. The pressure mounted. Investors filed lawsuits, news reports grew sharper, and whispers turned into shouts. Yet Ethan refused to admit defeat. He doubled down, signing more false contracts, promising returns he could never deliver. His arrogance was his armor, but also his poison. I watched from the sidelines, invisible but alert, as the world around him began to fracture. Former allies abandoned him, creditors closed in, and the parties grew smaller, filled not with admiration but with desperate attempts to mask his downfall. And still, he clung to the house, parading through its halls as if sheer will could hold the walls together. For me, the torment was unbearable. Was to know I had the power to end this charade, but also to know that exposing him would mean dragging every memory, every connection to my husband, into the harsh light of scandal. I wept for nights, torn between protecting my husband's name and reclaiming my own life. But Ethan left me no choice. When I discovered he had sold my husband's watch, the one he wore every day, the one I used to wind for him on Sunday mornings, something inside me snapped. That wasn't just greed. That was desecration. I held the folder tighter than ever. My hands shook, my heart pounded, but the decision had been made. I would bring the truth into the light. Ethan thought he had silenced me forever. He thought I was powerless, erased, forgotten, but the storm he had created was about to break, and when it did, he would face the reckoning he had earned, and I would be there to see him fall. The day I walked into the courthouse, folder clutched. Against my chest, the air felt heavy. Every step echoed like thunder in my ears. I wasn't just carrying papers. I was carrying years of betrayal, grief, and injustice. Inside, the room was already buzzing. Investors, creditors, and lawyers crowded the benches. Whispers flew like sparks in a dry forest. And then, Ethan walked in. He looked different. Gone was the polished suit and arrogant smirk. His tie hung loose. His eyes were bloodshot, and the confidence he once wore like armor was cracking. Still, when his gaze landed on me, he sneered. So, the widow decided to crawl out of her hole. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The judge called the case. Pages turned, voices rose, and soon the folder in my hands became the center of the storm. The forged contracts, the stolen signatures, the falsified ledgers. Piece by piece, Ethan's empire unraveled in front of everyone. At first, he laughed, pretending it was all a misunderstanding. "These documents mean nothing. My father would have wanted me to handle things this way." But when the judge asked for proof, real proof, Ethan faltered. His words stumbled, his excuses fell apart. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. He was drowning. And then came the final blow. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed man with a booming voice, stood up and produced an email chain. Ethan had promised impossible returns, using his father's name as leverage, long after his father had died. Gasps filled the room. The last thread of his credibility snapped. Ethan's face turned pale. He reached for words but found none. His arrogance had always fueled him, but now it betrayed him, leaving him naked in front of the world. The judge's gavel struck. "Ethan Carter, your assets are frozen pending investigation. You are hereby removed from control of the estate." The room erupted. Lawyers whispered, reporters scribbled, investors shouted. And in the middle of it all, Ethan stood frozen, stripped of the empire he thought untouchable. For me, it wasn't victory. Not yet. It was survival. I walked out of that courtroom into the sunlight, the weight of years slowly lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since my husband's death, I could breathe, but Ethan's fall didn't stop there. News traveled fast. Within days, headlines screamed of his fraud, the mansion he had fought to keep, the house that once echoed with my husband's laughter, was seized. His so-called friends vanished, his accounts drained, his reputation ruined. I stood at a distance as movers carried furniture out of the house piece by piece. Chandeliers, artwork, even the grand piano he loved to boast about, all gone. And then finally, the house itself was taken. The sight was bittersweet. I didn't celebrate his ruin. How could I? This wasn't about joy. This was about justice. About reclaiming the dignity he tried to strip from me. Weeks later, I heard he was living in a cramped apartment on the edge of town, dodging calls from lawyers, drowning in debts he could never repay. The man who once forced me out of my home now had nothing but the echoes of his own greed. And me? I returned not to the house. It was too stained with memories. But to myself. I rebuilt slowly, finding peace in small things. A garden in my backyard, old friends I'd pushed away in grief, nights where I could sleep without the weight of Ethan's cruelty pressing on my chest. Sometimes people asked me if I felt guilty. Watching him lose everything gave me a sense of regret. I thought about it. Truly I did. But then I remembered. The night he laughed in my face. The day he sold my husband's watch. The way he threw me out into the cold when I had nothing. And I knew the truth. No guilt. No regret. Just justice. In the end, Ethan didn't lose everything because of me. He lost everything because of who he was. I only gave fate a little nudge. In the quiet that followed, I often found myself sitting by the window, staring at the horizon. The storm had passed, but the scars it left were still tender. Losing my husband had already broken me once. Ethan's betrayal had threatened to hurt me a second time. But somehow, I was still here. I realized something important. Survival isn't about holding on to what's taken from you. It's about learning to live without it. The house was gone, the fortune vanished, but what mattered most wasn't the things I lost. It was the strength I found when I had nothing left. For weeks, I rebuilt piece by piece. I started working again, pouring myself into small routines that gave me purpose. I reconnected with friends who reminded me that family isn't always blood. It's who shows up when your world is falling apart. Slowly, the ache in my chest began to soften. Sometimes I'd hear whispers in town about Ethan. People said he wandered like a ghost, always angry, always bitter, a man haunted by the ruins of his own greed. Part of me wanted to hate him forever. Part of me wanted to forget he ever existed. But in the end, I chose something different. I let go. Letting go wasn't about forgiving him. It wasn't about pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about refusing to let him live rent-free in my heart any longer. His downfall was his own doing. My life, however, was still mine to live, and I did live. I learned that sometimes revenge isn't loud. It doesn't always look like shouting or fighting or burning everything down. Sometimes, revenge is quiet. It's waking up in the morning with peace in your chest, while the one who tried to destroy you is left to choke on the ashes of their own lies. Looking back now, I don't see myself as the victim Ethan wanted me to be. I see myself as the woman who walked through fire and didn't burn, the woman who took betrayal and turned it into strength. Because in the end, that's the only way forward. And if you're listening to this story, wondering if you'll ever survive the pain someone caused you, hear me clearly. You will. You're stronger than you think. Sometimes revenge isn't about screaming or fighting, it's about surviving. Ethan destroyed himself with his own greed, and I found peace. But I want to hear from you. What do you think is the real victory? Revenge or letting go? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, subscribe now, because the next story might just mirror your own.